The event of 1971 Christmas Eve would transform the life of this young woman forever. Barely 17 years old at that time, she had found herself in the Peruvian rainforest, a jungle filled with venomous snakes, mosquitoes, and spiders. Her clothes were torn, and she was covered in cuts and bruises. Despite her pain, she was determined to survive and live to tell her story. This is Juliane Kupke, and she has just survived one of the most extraordinary ordeals in the history of aviation, a plane crash that killed everyone aboard except her. When Kupke boarded LANSA Flight 508 together with 92 other passengers, she had no idea what was in store for her. The then 17-year-old was traveling with her mother from Lima, Peru to the eastern city of Pucallpa to join her father for Christmas when the unfortunate incident occurred. Her story of survival and the events that later followed is an incredible one. It all started earlier that day, on Christmas Eve 1971. Kupke, together with her mother, booked tickets to return to Panguana, a city in the Amazon rainforest, where her father, Hans Wilhelm Kupke, a renowned zoologist, was working. Growing up on a biological research station in the lush rainforest's ecosystem, Kupke became a self-described jungle child. There at Panguana, she was homeschooled for several years before she left for the Peruvian capital of Lima to finish her education, following the disapproval of her parents' school by authorities. Kupke's mother had wanted her to return to Panguana with her on the 19th or 20th of December. By so doing, she would spend some quiet time together before Christmas. However, Kupke, who had just completed her high school education in Lima, was eager to attend her graduation ceremony, scheduled for the 23rd of December. Understanding that her daughter's graduation wasn't important, she agreed to stay in Lima a bit longer so Kupke could participate in the graduation. As a result, they decided to book a flight for Christmas Eve, hoping to arrive in Pucallpa in time to celebrate Christmas with Kupke's father. The idea of spending Christmas together as a family was very important to them, making it worth the tight schedule. This decision ultimately placed them on LANSA Flight 508, setting the stage for the extraordinary events that followed. Having decided to book a flight on Christmas Eve, Kupke and her mother realized that all flights were fully booked except for one, a LANSA Flight 508, a turboprop airliner with the capacity to carry 99 people. Meanwhile, the airline had already lost 2 aircraft in previous crashes, and Kupke and her mother were aware. Even Kupke's dad had warned them to avoid flying with the airline due to its poor reputation. Nonetheless, they still went ahead to book the flight with the airline. The urgency to reunite with Kupke's father for Christmas outweighed their safety concerns. As Kupke later recounted in an interview with CNN, "We knew the airline had a bad reputation, but we desperately wanted to be with my father for Christmas, so we figured it would be all right." The decision put them on a flight that would change their lives forever. Once on board, they were seated in the second row from the back. Kupke took the window seat, while her mother sat beside her in the middle seat. The flight, which was expected to last under an hour, started smoothly. For the first 25 minutes, everything seemed normal. The two of them even enjoyed their sandwiches and admired the sprawling rainforest through the window, hoping to get to their destination soon. However, in less than 15 minutes to their landing, their peaceful journey was abruptly interrupted. What began as a routine flight suddenly took a terrifying turn, shattering their expectations and setting the stage for an unimaginable ordeal. The sky suddenly grew dark. Then out of the dark, without warning, a massive thunderstorm rolled in, and lightning flashes came from different directions, causing the plane to shake violently. Inside the cabin, chaos erupted. Overhead lockers burst open, sending luggage tumbling into the aisles. Wrapped gifts, personal belongings, and clothing spilled out, adding to the turmoil. The trays of half-eaten sandwiches and unfinished drinks became airborne, spilling on passengers as they clung to whatever they could grasp. The air was filled with the sounds of shouts and cries as fear gripped everyone on board. In the midst of the event, Kupke could hear her mother, who was known to be a nervous flyer, uttering a soft, almost whispered plea to no one in particular. "I hope this goes all right." It was a moment everyone was vulnerable, but still hopeful. Tragically, the situation was far from all right. Rather than subside, the storm only grew stronger, pushing the plane to the brink. The next thing, A huge flash of light illuminated the cabin as lightning struck the right wing of the plane. The impact was catastrophic, causing it to nosedive into the jungle below. The once steady hum of the engines was replaced by the panicked screams of the passengers. Kopsky heard her mother say from the seat beside her, "Now it's all over." And tragically for many it was. As the plane continued its uncontrolled descent, the unthinkable happened. The Lockheed L-188A Electra turboprop plane broke apart mid-air. The metal frame of the plane disintegrated, and Kopsky, still strapped to her seat, was ejected into the sky. Kopsky hurtled downwards, free-falling from an unimaginable height of 10,000 feet, 3,048 meters into the dense Amazon jungle. She would later recall how she thought the tops of the trees looked like heads of broccoli as she was plummeting to the earth. At some point, during the terrifying fall, Kopka lost consciousness. However, miraculously, she survived the impact. When she finally woke up, she was disoriented and writhing in pain. But the true shock came when she realized she was the only survivor out of the 92 passengers aboard the ill-fated flight. She thought to herself, "I survived an air crash." Though it was a statement of fact, the words barely captured the enormity of what had just occurred. Only a few people are lucky to survive a plane crash. Kopsky called out for her mother, and the jungle simply echoed back her shout. She was completely alone, stranded in the heart of the vast Amazon rainforest. Confused, Kopsky assessed her injuries. She quickly realized she had likely sustained a concussion. She had also broken her collarbone, and she had gashes to her shoulder and calf. Although the injuries were painful, they were not immediately life-threatening. At that point, her ordeal was just beginning, as she would spend the next days in the jungle. While she had survived the fall, she also had to survive the dreadful Amazonian rainforest. Kopsky laid there in the jungle for the rest of the day and a whole night, unable to move much as a result of the pain and shock. The next morning she remembered she was on the plane with her mother. She then decided to find her. With her glasses out of reach, she couldn't see clearly, making it hard to orient herself in the dense rainforest. Despite her injuries, Kopsky's survival instincts kicked in. As she later recalled, her parents taught her everything about the jungle. She could recognize the sounds of wildlife from Panguana. Immediately, she realized she was in the same jungle where she grew. In other words, she was not far from home. However, there could be a more difficult issue. Taking a wrong turn could make her walk deeper and deeper into the world's biggest rainforest, making escape nearly impossible. She knew she had to be cautious. She managed to detach herself from her seat and began to navigate the treacherous terrain of the Amazon rainforest almost blindly. The rainforest, although familiar from her childhood, was now a hostile and menacing environment to Kopka. Poisonous snakes, appearing like dry leaves, slithered through the undergrowth. Swarms of insects buzzed around her constantly, biting her exposed skin. The dense vegetation was alive with movement and noise. Kopka's wounds became infected since she was unable to get them treated. Amidst the pain, she also had to fend off the constant fear of not making it out of the jungle alive. But she was willing to take the risk. She soon came across a creek and drank water from it, knowing that dehydration would be her undoing. Then, she remembered the advice of her father, telling her to follow water downstream as that's where civilization would be. A small stream will flow into a bigger one, and then into a bigger one, and an even bigger one, and finally you'll run into help, her father once told her. With this knowledge, she activated her survival skills, which she had learned at her formative years. She floated midstream, hoping she would eventually encounter other humans. Sometimes she waded through the stream, at other times she swam, not minding she could be hurt by venomous water creatures. At that time, the jungle was in the midst of its wet season, so it rained heavily such that the jungle was too damp for her to even make a fire. Also, there were no fruits. Much of what grows in the jungle is poisonous, so I keep my hands off what I don't recognize, Kopka, who now goes by the name Dr. Diller, recalled. On the fourth day of her sojourn, she heard the noise of a landing king vulture which she immediately recognized. She grew up in her parents' reserve and could tell the sounds of different animals. She was scared because she knew they only land when there is a lot of carrion, and, obviously, there were some bodies from the crash. Turning to a corner in the creek, she found a bench with 3 fellow passengers still strapped to their seats. They had landed headfirst into the ground with a great force that they were buried 3 feet with their legs sticking straight up in the air. She was paralyzed by panic. It was the first time she had seen a dead body. After hesitating briefly, she ran to the scene. She wanted to be sure that the only woman among them was not her mother. At first she was horrified and didn't want to touch them, but to satisfy her curiosity she went ahead, taking a stick and knocking a shoe off the woman's body. The woman's toes were polished, and her mother never used polish on her nails. She took a deep breath and faced the reality that she was alone in the jungle. Amongst these passengers, however, Kupka found a pack of sweets. It would serve as her only food source for the rest of her days in the forest. Not long after, Kupka heard rescue planes and helicopters hovering above her head. She screamed and waved her hands, hoping they would sight her. Unfortunately, all efforts to draw their attention proved abortive. The plane crash had prompted the biggest search in Peru's history, but due to the thickness of the forest, aircraft couldn't even spot any wreckage from the crash, including the only survivor. After some time, Kupka couldn't hear them and knew that she was indeed on her own to find help. She summoned courage and continued through the rainforest. She waded through jungle streams infested with crocodiles, piranhas, and devil rays. Sometimes she would encounter a crocodile on the bank, but she wouldn't get afraid even if it faced her. She was aware that crocodiles don't tend to attack humans. Only someone who has lived among wildlife could have such knowledge. Kupka was wearing a very short sleeveless mini dress and white sandals. She had lost one shoe, but kept the other so she could test the ground ahead of her as she walked. By the 10th day, Kupka was near exhaustion. She had eaten only a bag of sweets she'd found at the crash site, and thought she might starve. She could hardly stand properly as she drifted along the edge of a larger river she had found. She felt so isolated from the human universe, far away from the reach of any human being. Then that afternoon, something spectacular happened. Kepke found a large boat moored on the edge of the river. At first, she thought she was only hallucinating. But as she moved closer and touched it, she realized it was real. Immediately, she felt a sense of relief. What she saw was a lifeline, an indication that she was close to where humans were. Again, her eyes were fixed on a nearby path. Summoning the last of her strength, she followed the path and found a small hut. Kepka approached the open-air shack, which was unoccupied. Exhausted, she collapsed on the doorstep. Then she saw an outboard motor and a can of gasoline. She had an open wound on her upper right arm. It was infested with maggots about 1 centimeter long. She then remembered how her family dog had the same infection, and her father had put kerosene in it. She wasted no time further and sucked the gasoline out, pouring it into the wound. The pain was as intense as the maggots tried to get further into the wound. After pulling out about 30 maggots, she got some relief. She then decided to spend the night there. Since she was already exhausted, she soon fell asleep. The next day, she woke up to some voices. They were the local Peruvian forest fishermen who had returned to their shelter. At first, they were startled to see a skinny, dirty blonde girl. They thought she was a kind of water goddess. Local legend considers water goddess as a figure who is a hybrid of a water dolphin and a blonde, white-skinned woman. But she wasn't close to one. Luckily, her parents had taught her some Spanish, enough to communicate who she was and what had happened to her. "I'm a girl who was in the Lanza crash. My name is Julianne," she said to them in their native tongue. The men pitied her and treated her wounds. They also gave her something to eat, and the next day they took her out of the remote wilderness by canoe to reach a village, which was a more inhabited area. The journey took them 11 hours. From there, rescue workers airlifted her to a Peru hospital where she received medical attention for her physical injuries. At last, Kepka had been found, after 11 harrowing days along in the jungle. Soon, she was reunited with her father, who made frantic efforts searching for news of his wife. On January 12th, they found her body. Kepka mourned her mother. The loss of a parent is a tragedy that is very difficult to cope with. After she was well enough, she assisted search parties to help locate the plane crash site and recover the bodies of the victims, including her mother's. It's believed that 14 people survived the impact, including Kupka's mother, but they were not lucky enough to trek out of the jungle like Köpke. Eventually, the cause of the crash was revealed. It was listed as an intentional decision by the airline to send the plane into hazardous weather conditions. Köpke later learned the aircraft was made entirely of spare parts from other planes. With her survival, Juliane joined a small league of other similar survivors. Dozens of people have fallen from planes and walked away relatively unscathed. There was the 23-year-old Serbian flight attendant, Vesna Vulovi, who survived the world's longest-known fall from a plane without a parachute just 1 year after Köpke's survival. A mid-air explosion in 1972 saw Vulovi plummet 9 kilometers into thick snow in Czechoslovakia. She suffered a skull fracture, 2 broken legs and a broken back. Even at that, she lived. Till today, no one has an explanation as to how and why she survived. Köpke would later postulate several theories about how she made it back in one piece. She thought the powerful updraft of the thunderstorm slowed her descent while the thick canopy of leaves cushioned her landing. Life after the traumatic crash was difficult for Köpke. She would later develop a deep fear of flying, and for years, she had recurring nightmares about the crash. I had nightmares for a long time, for years, and of course the grief about my mother's death and that of the other people came back again and again. The thought, why was I the only survivor, haunts me. It always will, Köpke would later recall. But just as she survived in the jungle, she overcame her fears. Like her parents, Köpke went on to study biology at the University of Kiel in Germany in 1980, later obtaining her doctorate degree from Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. She returned to Peru to do research in mammalogy, with a focus on bats. In 1989, Köpke married Erich Diller, a German entomologist who specializes in parasitic wasps. Some 9 years later, she returned to the site of the crash for the documentary Wings of Hope about her incredible story. On her flight with director Werner Herzog, she once again sat in seat 19F, the same seat she sat on the crashed plane. Köpke found the experience to be therapeutic. It was the first time she was able to focus on the incident from a distance. Therefore, she gained a sense of closure that she had yet to get. Following the death of her father in 2000, she took over the research station, becoming the director in the very jungle that nearly claimed her life. In 2011, Köpke wrote a memoir called When I Fell from the Sky. In the book, she recounted her harrowing experience in the jungle, her survival strategies, and how found purpose amidst chaos. The book won Carine Literature Prize that year. In 2019, the government of Peru conferred on her the title of Grand Officer of the Order of Merit for Distinguished Services. And that's the story of Köpke's fall from the sky and her rise to stardom. While the crash and the aftermath trauma remained with Köpke for over the decades, she found meaning in her life and her work. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to hit that like button. Remember to share and subscribe for more videos.